Beginning of 1941. Germany, having established control over most of Europe, is preparing to launch an invasion of the territory of the Soviet Union. According to the plans of the German command, the German army was supposed to conduct an offensive in 3 directions simultaneously. Army Group South was supposed to advance in the direction of Kiev and capture the crossings across the Dnieper, so that subsequently, continuing the offensive, cut off the Soviet army from the oil fields in the Caucasus. Army Group Center was supposed to advance towards Moscow in order to capture the capital of the Soviet Union. At the same time, Army Group North was supposed to launch an offensive in the Baltic region and rapidly advance to reach the outskirts of Leningrad, after which it would block the city and establish control over it. From the north, the blockade of Leningrad was to be ensured by the Army of Finland, which was an ally of Germany. It is important to mention that Hitler considered it a much more important task to establish control over Leningrad rather than Moscow, stating that Moscow was just a geographical entity compared to Leningrad. The fact is that the factories of Leningrad produced about 12% of all Union industrial products, therefore, having lost this industrial center, the Red Army would have been significantly weakened. On June 22, 1941, the German army invaded the territory of the Soviet Union without declaring war. Having secured a numerical superiority over the Red Army in the main directions of attack, the German army groups began a rapid offensive in accordance with the previously drawn-up plan. Already on June 25, the aviation of the Northern Front, together with the aviation of the Baltic Fleet, launched a massive attack on the airfields of Finland and northern Norway, where, in addition to the Finnish aviation itself, the German 5th Air Army was based. Of course, the massive airstrike could not prevent Finland from entering the war on the side of Germany, but nevertheless it weakened the military power of the Finnish army. Already on June 29, the Finnish army invaded the territory of the Soviet Union and launched an offensive in Karelia, as well as towards Leningrad. Meanwhile, the divisions of Army Group North were also rapidly moving towards Leningrad and by July 12 reached the vicinity of the Luga defensive line erected by the Red Army. Thanks to the strengthening of this defensive line, in the construction of which the local population took part, as well as the use of new heavy tanks KV-1 and KV-2 produced by the Kirov plant, the advance of the German divisions was stopped for 2 weeks. It should be mentioned that the delay in the movement of Army Group North caused sharp dissatisfaction with Hitler, who personally arrived at the headquarters of Army Group North and demanded that a plan to capture Leningrad be prepared no later than September. The German command, having failed to overcome the Luga defensive line on the move, began to regroup troops and pull up reserves, thanks to which the German divisions on August 8 launched a new offensive from a previously captured bridgehead in the vicinity of Bolshoy-Sabsk towards the city of Krasnogvardisk. At the same time, the German army began assault operations along the entire length of the Luga defensive line, and a few days later the Red Army's defenses were broken through in the vicinity of Shimsk. Despite the fierce resistance of the Red Army, the German divisions moved forward, and by August 15 the German army managed to capture Novgorod, and on August 20 the city of Chudovo. The Red Army was forced to retreat under the pressure of the enemy, who, building on their success on August 30, was able to establish control over the village of Mga, thereby cutting the last railway that connected Leningrad with the rest of the territory of the Soviet Union. In the face of a numerically superior enemy, the Red Army continued to fiercely resist, which is why the German command, fearing excessive losses, abandoned plans to storm Leningrad. Instead, on August 28, the command of Army Group North developed a new plan, which involved encircling the city and destroying it with the help of aviation and artillery. Also, German divisions received orders to suppress attempts by the local population to leave the surrounded city. The fact that, according to the plans of the German command after the encirclement of Leningrad, Army Group North was supposed to transfer a significant part of its forces to Army Group Center, which was advancing on Moscow, deserves special mention. But the resistance of the defenders of Leningrad did not allow this to be done. Moreover, Army Group North received additional forces, which, according to the German command, should have allowed it to cope with the task. Meanwhile, the Finnish army also advanced towards Leningrad, but upon reaching the Karelian fortified area it was stopped by the Red Army. Mannerheim, despite German demands, refused to storm the Karelian fortified area, as he feared that even at the cost of high losses he might not be able to overcome it. Instead, the Finnish army carried out an offensive north of Lake Ladoga and managed to cut the Kirov Railway, as well as the Volga-Baltic route and the White Sea-Baltic Canal, thereby blocking a significant part of the cargo delivery routes to Leningrad. On September 8, German divisions managed to capture Schlüsselburg and thereby close the ring of the blockade of Leningrad. On September 10, the commander of Army Group North, von Lieb, gave the order to begin the assault on the city. The Red Army defended itself fiercely, but since the enemy had a numerical advantage, the defense of the Soviet troops around the city was broken through. On September 13, Zhukov arrived in the city, who immediately began to regroup the available forces, planning to defend Leningrad at any cost. Meanwhile, the German army, taking advantage of the breakthrough in the defense of Leningrad, developed success, thanks to which it was able to establish control over Pushkin, Krasno Selo and Slutsk, as well as reach the shores of the Gulf of Finland in the Peterhof area. On the night of September 20, the Red Army tried to break the blockade of Leningrad by secretly crossing the Neva. The 115th Infantry Division and the 4th Marine Brigade were able to establish control over the village of Moskovskaya Dubrovka and began expanding the bridgehead. Thanks to the transfer of additional forces of the Red Army, it was possible to expand the bridgehead to 4 kilometers, but the German command hastily pulled reserves into the bridgehead area and carried out a series of counterattacks, due to which the size of the bridgehead was reduced to 2 kilometers along the front and 700 meters in depth. Due to high losses, the German army was unable to destroy the bridgehead, but the Red Army did not have enough strength to expand it. Fierce fighting in this place continued, and the bridgehead itself went down in history as the Nevsky Pyatakchok. In 1942, the command of the Red Army carried out the Lublin and Sinyavinsk operations with the goal of breaking the blockade, but due to lack of forces, the Red Army failed to achieve the desired result. It should be mentioned that from the moment of the blockade of the city in which, in addition to the local garrison, the local population in Leningrad was locked up, problems with food began and very soon a city began in the city. The only supply route for the city passed through Lake Ladoga. It was called the Road of Life. German aviation tried with all its might to interrupt the supply of the city along this route, but it was unable to cope with this task. Despite the huge problems with food, the city's factories continued to operate, supplying the local garrison with the necessary weapons. As time went, the Red Army managed to inflict a serious defeat on the German army near Moscow, and while the Battle of Stalingrad was in full swing, which was yet to become a turning point in the war, the command of the Leningrad and Folkhof fronts was developing a plan to break the blockade of Leningrad, which involved delivering simultaneous attacks by divisions of the Leningrad and Folkhof fronts in the area Schlüsselburg and Sinyavino in order to restore connections between Leningrad and the rest of the Soviet Union. The operation, which was called Iskra, began on the night of January 12, 1943. Soviet bombers launched a massive attack on the enemy's fortified positions in the breakthrough zone, as well as on railway junctions and airfields in his rear. At 9:30 in the morning, the artillery of both fronts began artillery preparation, which lasted several hours, after which the 67th Army of the Leningrad Front and the 2nd Shock Army of the Folkhof Front went on the offensive against the positions of the 18th German Army. The Wehrmacht divisions offered fierce resistance, but by the end of the day the Red Army managed to seize a bridgehead on the left bank of the river in the Mariino area, after which the construction of the crossing immediately began, which was ready by January 14. At the same time, the 2nd Shock Army also launched an offensive, but due to the impassable peat bogs, it developed rather slowly. The German command immediately began transferring additional forces to the area of the Red Army's offensive. Thanks to the numerous defense centers created during the Siege of Leningrad, German divisions were able to establish an effective defense, which is why the Soviet command decided to bring the second echelons of the armies participating in the offensive into battle. Thanks to the introduction of additional forces of the Red Army into the battle, it was possible to compensate for the arrival of German reserves, and on January 15, the 86th Infantry Division of the Red Army reached the outskirts of Schlisselburg. It deserves special attention that during the offensive the Red Army managed to capture two of the newest German heavy tanks Tiger, which were sent to the Kubinka training ground for study. Despite the fierce resistance of the enemy, by January 18, the divisions of the Leningrad and Folkhof fronts were separated by only a few kilometers. Already on January 20, the Soviet armies advancing towards each other formed a common front, after which the Red Army began to advance towards the village of Mga. By this time, the enemy managed to transfer additional forces, which strengthened his defenses in previously prepared positions. The Red Army advanced, overcoming fierce enemy resistance. But the offensive developed rather slowly, and on April 2, the troops of the Leningrad and Folkhof fronts received orders to stop the offensive towards the village of Mga and go on the defensive. Despite the fact that the Red Army failed to destroy the enemy group in the area of the villages of Mga and Sinyavino, the blockade of Leningrad was broken, and the supply of both the garrison and the population of the city began to improve. A period of relative calm began on the Leningrad front. German troops, of course, continued shelling and bombing the city, and the Red Army continued to conduct counter-battery warfare, but the opponents did not carry out major operations until the beginning of 1944. By that time, the Red Army had managed to defeat the German army in the Battle of the Kursk salient, after which it became obvious even to the German command that Germany's defeat was a matter of time. However, the German divisions continued to fight fiercely even though their fate was already predetermined. Soon, the Soviet command developed Operation January Thunder, which involved launching counter-strikes from the Oranienbaum bridgehead and from the outskirts of Leningrad, as well as a subsequent attack by a common front on enemy positions. The task was complicated by the fact that from the moment the Siege of Leningrad began, the German army did not sit idly by and managed to build powerful defensive lines. In this operation, the command of the Leningrad front planned to use the Second Shock Army, which, with the help of the Baltic Fleet, was transferred to the Oranienbaum bridgehead, as well as the 42nd Army, which was supposed to launch an offensive from the Pulkovo area. Simultaneously with Operation January Thunder, the command of the Red Army planned to launch the Novgorod-Luga offensive operation, which involved the 67th, 8th, 54th and 59th Armies conducting an offensive on Novgorod and Luga. With a successful combination of circumstances, the simultaneous conduct of the Novgorod-Luga offensive operation and the January Thunder operation would have made it possible to encircle most of the forces of the 18th German Army, thanks to which the Red Army could begin preparations for the liberation of the Baltic region. Both offensive operations began on January 14, 1944. After a massive artillery and aviation strike, the troops of the Leningrad and Folkhof fronts went on the offensive. On the very first day of the offensive, the forces of the 59th Army managed to bypass Novgorod from the south along the ice of Lake Ilmen, which made it possible to begin an operation to encircle the city. In turn, the German command, fearing the encirclement of the city garrison, began hastily pulling additional forces into the Novgorod area. Relying on a fortified line of defense, the German divisions resisted fiercely, but the Red Army still moved forward. On January 18, it became obvious that the German divisions would not be able to hold back the advance of the Red Army. On this day, the German garrison of Novgorod received an order to leave the city to avoid encirclement, and the forces of the Second Shock Army managed to establish control over Rapsha. Also on January 18, the assault on Krasnoye Selo and Voronezh Gora began. On January 20, 1944, Novgorod fell into the hands of the Red Army without a fight. In the morning of the same day, the forces of the 2nd Shock and 42nd Armies met south of Rapsha and, having surrounded the settlement, soon destroyed the remnants of the Peterhof-Strelninsky enemy group. On the northern flank of the Folkhof front, the offensive was slow due to the large number of enemy defensive structures, but nevertheless, by the evening of January 21, the village of Mga came under the control of the Red Army, thanks to which control over the Kirov railway was restored. Also on January 21, the command of the 18th German Army, assessing the situation, began to withdraw its forces from the outskirts of Leningrad, while strengthening the defense of Krasnogvardsk, the garrison of which was supposed to cover the withdrawal of the main forces. The Red Army, having learned about the enemy's plans, continued the offensive, planning to encircle the divisions of the 18th Army. On January 26, the Red Army divisions managed to establish control over Krasnogvardsk, thanks to which the retreating enemy forces were divided into two parts, a smaller one, which retreated towards Narva, and a larger one, which retreated towards the city of Luga. In this situation, the main forces of the 2nd Shock and 42nd Armies began pursuing the enemy retreating towards Narva and by January 30 reached the banks of the Luga River. Having quickly broken the enemy's defenses on the Luga River, the Red Army forced him to hastily retreat to the Narva River. Also, the divisions of the 42nd Army advancing to the southwest were able, having reached the Luga River, to cross it in the area of Bolshoy-Sabsk and occupy a bridgehead on the western bank. Nevertheless, the divisions of the Folkhof front advancing from the east failed to occupy the city of Luga until the beginning of February, since the enemy pulled additional forces into the Luga area and defended fiercely. Soviet troops managed to occupy Luga only on February 12, 1944. During this time, the enemy managed to withdraw a significant part of the 18th Army, which thus avoided complete defeat. Nevertheless, German troops were driven back to the Panther Line, passing through Narva, Pskov, Vitebsk and Orsha, where the enemy planned to hold back the onslaught of Soviet troops. This was the end of the defense of Leningrad, but despite a series of defeats, German troops still resisted, since the German command was still confident of changing the course of the war. If you liked this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel and click on the bell so you don't miss new videos.